Okay, Nick.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Modern Day Debates. My name is Nicholas Suter. I am standing in for James. No, he did not suddenly get much more dashing and handsome. I am standing in for him. He is unfortunately unable to make it, but he wanted the debate to continue, and so we will be debating today. We are having a Lion's Head debate, an atheist versus two creationists. The atheist is going to be Jordan. Jordan, if you want to say hello there. And although he's muted, we're all
sorry.
still muted.
I had so many mutes going on. Yeah, I'm Jordan. I don't know if you want me to introduce myself. From Reason to Doubt with a 2. I'm a mechanical and nuclear engineer, and sometimes on the weekends I do stuff like this.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you very much for coming. And on the affirmative, we're debating, does the evidence support a literal interpretation of Genesis? And for the affirmative, we have Raw Matt and Standing for Truth. Matt, how are you?
I'm doing good. It's my second debate here, so exciting. Always.
And that means I've been here for 100% of your debates as well.
That's
is what that
right.
means.
Yep, you and me.
Well, like I said, I'm bummed that you don't have the Tutankhamun thing, but okay, fine. James is such a spoil sport. And we also have Standing for Truth. Standing for Truth, welcome.
Thanks, Nick. Happy to be here. Thanks, Jordan, for doing this. Thanks, Nick, for moderating, and thanks, Praise, for hosting. Really looking forward to this.
All right. Well, so as I said, the topic is, does the evidence support a literal interpretation of Genesis? We are going to have 12-minute openings for each side. Now, what that means is that Raw Matt and Standing for Truth will actually have to split the time between them. I believe they've already arranged how they're going to do that. Jordan will have, of course, the full time for his side. 10-minute rebuttals for each side. Then we're going to have a 30-minute open discussion, and then we will have an 8-minute closing from each side. Now, I've said this before, and I already talked to the participants here. As a mod, I do believe one of my jobs is to make sure that the debate continues on smoothly. There's always going to be miscommunication, and there's always going to be talking past each other. That's part of a debate. But if it gets to the point where we're really going in circles, people are saying the same thing over and over and over again, if there's a way that I can sit there and maybe try to reframe it and interject something and just get the debate moving forward, nobody wants a dumpster fire. Well, that's not true. Plenty of people want a dumpster fire. If you want a dumpster fire, today is not the day to do it. I think we'd all like to see the debate moving forward, whichever side is ahead or whatever you want to argue. We'd like to see forward progress. So if it looks like we're really stuck, I will interject and try to dislodge it. I don't always.
I'm sorry, I was just looking at the live chat. A bunch of people are saying there's an echo. So I'm not sure. It could be somebody who has the live stream on at the same time as their as it's going on. So I'm not sure. They're just saying there's an echo. I'm not sure.
It's probably, I would assume it's on Praise I Am side. Now that's because he is, unless somebody else hears an echo with me, but I would assume that is his OBS client, and he may have, this happens if you have the mic also going through the desktop, especially when you set it up with, what is it? We're using Zoom.
Yeah.
So sometimes Zoom, his mic may, we can try that, but thank you. I hadn't caught any.
Apparently it's been fixed. So whoever, Praise, if that was you, good job. The audience says we're all good. Sorry.
He muted himself. Sound is still out of sync, but he muted himself. I think that may have done it. So if he mutes himself, that may help. Now he's going to be helping with the super chats and or with the time. I can also do the time, and it may be that I will try to also do the time as well. I may miss it, but between the two of us, we'll try to keep an eye on the time and the super chats, and we will see what's what. So is everybody all set? Are we sort of clear on what we're going to be doing tonight? Perfect. All right. The affirmative is that the evidence does support a literal interpretation of Jesus, and I believe Matt is going first for the affirmative. Is that correct?
I think Standing is actually. I'm going to take
all right.
time he doesn't use.
All right. And standing for truth, it is all yours, and I'll start the timer. And you wanted to split the time evenly, so I am giving you 6 minutes.
Awesome. Let me just share this first before you start the timer. Let me get all set here.
All right, so I started the timer when I did my intro. You've got 2 minutes left.
Oh, that leaves me about 30 seconds. I better talk fast.
Aren't you glad I'm modding? You want to retract that Nick's fair statement? Okay.
Oh, now I only got 20 seconds. Thanks, Nick.
No problem.
All right, guys. Okay, we can start now. Thanks for doing this. Like I said earlier, we got biblical creation, Genesis, and science. Is Genesis consistent with empirical science? The Bible in Genesis tells us that we were created in his image. And therefore, if we look at how humans have made things, created things, designed things, for example, this can then give us an idea or an inspiration into the patterns in which God may have used to ultimately create things in the beginning. Now, naturally, we as humans have and do design things with groups within groups patterns. If you were to look at the types of vehicles or modes of transportation humans have created, they naturally form groups within groups patterns. For example, a sedan has a tremendous amount of similarities with other sedans. Now, a semi-tractor trailer is obviously much different than a sedan or a car, but these two modes of transportation are similar enough to each other that it sets them apart from airplanes. This is the groups within groups pattern that emerges when we look at all the modes of vehicles or transportation that humans have designed. What is this? This is an empirical observation, and this is something we naturally do. Why wouldn't God do the same thing? Why couldn't God create specific kinds of creatures in the beginning that are different from us as humans, as well as kinds of creatures that are more similar to us? Therefore, nested hierarchies in DNA are also predicted by creationists based on this design model. The classification of life can be compared to classification of modes of transportation on how different companies manufacture cars based on their similarities, forming hierarchies. Biblical creation has a multitude of lines of evidence. For example, humans are fundamentally different from all other forms of life when we consider genomics and functionality. We also see that genetic change is actually down and not up. We are therefore devolving due to mutation accumulation. Natural selection cannot stop this mutation accumulation. A question I would have for Jordan would be, what type of selection can rid the population of so many mutations that are pouring in, that are unselectable, that are nearly neutral, slowly degrading our genome? Another one that comes to mind is information in general. The information in our genomes cannot arise through mutation and natural selection, as we know that there exists multiple overlapping codes in our DNA. All you have to do is picture receiving an email and finding that it has 3 totally different messages, where you get one message when read normally, one message when read in reverse, and one when reading every other letter. What does this indicate? This indicates data compression at the highest level, which extends far beyond any computer program ever written by man. Our genome is polyfunctional and polyconstrained. Any change, no matter how minute, will have an effect. The junk DNA era has been completely overturned and is no longer a valid form of evidence for evolutionists. Molecular clocks, for example, and other dating methods most consistently point to a young genome. Even fossils. The fossil record, what does it support? It supports massive death and burial on a global scale. This is exactly what the Bible describes. The existence of a fossil in general is proof that it happened quickly. Let's look at our hypothesis, the created heterozygosity hypothesis. Now, genetically, what it goes back to is this idea of big A, big B, little b. It's pre-existing functional DNA differences. Now, if Adam and Eve were created genetically homogeneous with no variety in their DNA, all capital letters or all lowercase letters, for example, then of course the evolutionists would have a point, because it would be difficult to create the variety that we see in just a few thousand years. And that's a common evolutionist objection to the biblical creation model. And this too goes for the kinds of animals God created, Adam, Eve, and these specific created kinds, with capital A, lowercase a, capital B, lowercase b. And if you do that for the millions of DNA positions that actually exist in the genome, that means they have the potential to produce all sorts of variety in a single generation. We've now got multiple lines of evidence indicating that this was the case, that God created Adam, Eve, and the kinds in the beginning. So they have the potential within themselves to produce all sorts of variety. And in the case of animal kinds, all sorts of species in what some would call an evolutionary heartbeat. Evolutionists assume mutations as a source of all variety and reject the idea of front-loaded genetic variety. Evolutionists state, no, this is all a process of genetic mistakes, which precludes from even considering the possibility that there is front-loaded genetic variety and created DNA functional differences from the start. They have then missed this incredible explanation for how millions of species and incredible variety could have come about in just a few thousand years. In regards to how long?
20 seconds. Sorry, I should have given you 20 seconds.
In regards to animal species, we can see the echo of this hypothesis in the breeds that have been formed, which are formed by pre-existing genetic variety. This hypothesis is not ad hoc because it makes testable predictions on speciation rates, mutation rates, the forming of species, as well as DNA function. Matt, do you want me to take an extra minute just to finish this off, brother?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. For example, it makes specific predictions on junk DNA, and the trajectory of discovery now favors genome-wide functionality. For sake of time, Jordan and I can discuss that in the discussion portion. There are three main events in Scripture, specifically in Genesis, which is what we're defending here, that we can address with modern genetics: the creation of Adam and Eve, the flood of Noah, the Tower of Babel. In Matt's time, he's going to cover some of that stuff, mitochondrial Eve, Y chromosome Adam, for example. I'll end it here with this chart. Have a look at this visually. We can make testable predictions. The creationists are the ones making the future testable predictions. It is widely known that human mitochondrial DNA differences, they divide into three major groups designated L, M, and N. And you can see this in this graph here, this mitochondrial DNA map. These are the three major haplogroups. The history of humanity is in our genome. What we actually know about mitochondrial DNA of humans fits the biblical base model. The model explains the three haplogroups and the relative differences pre- and post-flood humanity. I want to see Jordan address this and also make better testable predictions on this mitochondrial DNA map. We know mitochondrial DNA is inherited exclusively from mothers.
You're a bit over time, and I'm taking a bit more from Matt, just FYI.
Perfect. Almost done here. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Now, what's important here is there were three young women. They were married women on the ark who would have repopulated the earth after the flood 4,500 years ago. The fact that there are three major haplogroups of human mitochondrial DNA in the world is amazing confirmation of this model and of a literal interpretation of Genesis, because these predictions, the retrodictions, these hypotheses are flowing perfectly from Genesis. Also very consistent is the Babel dispersion, where one would expect sudden formation of several variants in human mitochondrial DNA due to rapid separation and isolation of various groups of people. Now, on this tree and map of humanity, the three major haplogroups are joined by relatively short line segments, indicating that there's not much difference between them. This is consistent with a pre-flood world of only 10 generations, long ages, being that there are little differences between them. These women came from a world where only a few generations had lived before them. And from these three major nodes emit dozens of mitochondrial DNA variants, each at a relatively greater distance than the three major haplogroups, if you're looking at this map, of course. Obviously, since Babel, there have been many generations accounting for the relatively larger distances between the dozens of mitochondrial DNA variants we see today and the three major haplogroups from which they have emerge. This is incredible and irrefutable. We can get into the specific testable predictions on mapping the history of civilization and mutation rates in the most divergent of African people groups, the Khoisan peoples, for example. We can touch on that in the discussion portion. Take over, Matt.
Matt, you got 3:30.
All right. Okay, well, he gave you 3 major predictions. I'll give you some more because Genesis makes a lot of claims. It's not a science book, but it makes specific statements. The Bible in the very beginning does state that there was a beginning. It mentions that in the beginning. Was there a beginning to all things? Well, yes, we know today that there was. And the Bible is very clear. And this was a time when everyone thought that the universe was eternal. So it's pretty strict and it clarifies that. The Bible also said that God made man in the beginning, and there were just 2 people, and all people came from them, from those 2 people. And I would love for Jordan to prove that mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam weren't the first people, but the only contention that he or anyone can actually have are the dates of those people. So because I'm low on time, I'll leave that for the discussion portion. Next, we have that God put Adam to sleep, and he took from his side the rib where he made Eve. What does science tell us about ribs? Well, the rib is the only bone in the human body that can regrow once it's been removed. This is, but yet this is not a case with a single primate. This is from a book that was supposedly written by sheep herders 5,000 years ago that got this right. Well, what about the color? What color was Adam and Eve, and where were they created, and why does it matter? Well, the Bible says that they came from the Middle East, out of the Fertile Crescent. Well, what do people look like that live there? They all have brown skin, right? Yet secular science tells us that man evolved out of Africa, and they would have had black skin if they were Africans. Well, what does science tell us about skin colors? Well, skin color is governed by genes, and genes come in pairs. 2 pairs from each parent inherited. For this discussion, let's say that it's A and G for these genes, right? So now brown colored pigment skin, people contain a lowercase a and an uppercase. Let's say they're lower cases. So sorry, I kind of messed that up. Black people would have the gene that is all uppercase, right? So a capital A, and a capital G. Light-skinned people would carry lowercase a and a GG gene. But brown-skinned people would have the uppercase A and a lowercase a, containing within them all the variants for all of the races that we see in the world today. So they had to be brown-skinned people from that area. They were not black. So that disproves the out of Africa theory. Next, we're going to be that God taught Adam language and Adam named the animals. What do we have today? Well, when we're looking at p-value, which is scientific statistical hypothesis, everything is based off of that. So we know based on the human language acquisition from the 1960s that all of the stochastic models that have ever existed, nobody over the age of 13 can learn human language. And p-value has statistically proven that language cannot arise on its own. So we have valid proof scientifically that happened. We also have genealogical trees that prove that Genesis was
1 minute.
Sorry, was that it?
1 minute. Sorry, I was giving you a 1 minute warning.
All right. We also have these genealogical trees which show that, and from multiple places on Earth, that show that lineages go back to Noah, and 2 places on Earth where they can be traced through royal families all the way back to Adam. Matter of fact, the Chinese said the year was 2000, or the year 2000 was 4,700. They're dated back from the flood. The Assyrian calendar, the Saxons have a genealogy going back to Adam. The Danes and Norwegians both have a king's list that goes back to Noah. So these are lineage things that we can track to prove these things true. So what's the bottom line? Well, the Bible tells us, and genetics confirms, that we are all descendants from Adam and Eve. And all of the evidence proves that Adam were the first parents of all humanity, and they were created in the Middle East in the Fertile Crescent, and their skin was brown, not black, disproving the out of Africa theory. And God taught Adam language. We also have stated earlier that the haplogroups in biology, genetics, genealogies, and population growths of human and animal species all help prove the Genesis account.
All right, perfect. Thank you very much. Now, let me reset my clock here. And so, Jordan, you are going to get 12 minutes, and you can start whenever you're ready.
All right, thanks, everybody. My name is Jordan. I'm a mechanical and nuclear engineer, and I am convinced that the universe is 13.8 billion years old, and all life evolved by natural selection. But just 10 years ago, I would have agreed with everything my interlocutors just said, because at that time, I myself was a young Earth creationist. One day, I was talking about my views with a coworker of mine, and he handed me a book that was called The Language of God by Dr. Francis Collins, a Christian geneticist. I was skeptical, but I read it anyway. Much to my surprise, the book contained answers to a lot of the objections I had, but more importantly, it armed me with better questions. Though I still wanted to believe in young Earth creationism, I made a decision after reading that book. I decided that the truth was important to me, and that if I was right, the evidence would confirm it, and if I was wrong, I wanted to know. After months of investigation, I found the evidence did not confirm my beliefs, so I did something that I think is beautiful. I changed my beliefs. I'd need a lot more time than I have to go over all of the evidence that I found, so I'm going to focus on the age of the Earth. The young Earth model, as I mentioned, gives it a few thousand years. But before I can do that, we have to talk about some physics. So I'm a nuclear engineer, so we're going to talk about nuclear physics. In a nuclear reactor, heat is generated by a process called nuclear fission, wherein a uranium atom absorbs a neutron and breaks down into two other atoms called fission fragments. You end up with very rare isotopes not found in nature, so if you see large quantities of them, you know that fission happened. It's the only way to get them. You might think of this as a fingerprint for fission. You need only one neutron to start fission, but you get 2 or 3 out of it, meaning you can have a chain reaction. But there's 2 caveats to that. One, the neutrons are moving very fast, and you need them to move slow. So you have to have a moderator, a material that the neutrons will bounce around in and slow down. That water will do that. The second catch is you have to have enriched uranium. In nature, uranium is 0.7% enriched. That means 0.7% of it is U-235. The rest of it is U-238. You need 3% enriched uranium to have that chain reaction. Now, that might have been confusing, but all you need to remember is water plus 3% uranium equals fission. So remember all that super rare stuff, the fragments that are the fingerprint for fission? You'd expect that to find that like the stuff that comes out of a nuclear reactor. You wouldn't expect to find it in the ground in a mine, but that is exactly what happened in Africa at a place called Oklo. In 1972, the uranium they pulled out of the ground was found to be not 0.7% enriched as expected, but instead as low as 0.3%. At first, they thought they'd lost some uranium, which would be a big deal because bombs. But upon further investigation at the mines, they found fission products, those fingerprints we talked about. And how could that possibly be? I mean, they had the water, that first part of the equation. The geology of Oklo led to water transporting uranium there. That's why there was a deposit there to mine in the first place. But what about the enrichment? Well, all uranium is slowly decaying away. U-235, the fissile stuff, decays much faster than U-238. That means 100 years from now, uranium that you find will be less enriched than it is now. But if you go backwards, the reverse is true. It becomes more enriched. How far back do you need to go in order to get that magic 3%? The answer to that is 1.7 billion years. So about 2 billion years ago, something amazing happened. You add water, and you had 3% enriched uranium at the same place at the same time, which gives you the coolest thing in the history of things, a naturally occurring nuclear reactor. No human involved, purely nature. It was actually predicted in 1956 by Paul Kuroda. Now, as cool as that is, the Oklo phenomena, it's a problem for the young Earth model because we know fission occurred. Even AIG doesn't dispute that. But getting the enrichment we know you need to have takes 2 billion years. Well, what if the uranium decayed faster in the past? That would fix it, right? Well, it turns out it's not so easy. See, if something decays faster, it's more radioactive by definition. So how much more radioactive would the uranium need to be to fit all that 2 billion years and 7,000 years? 34,530 times as radioactive. To put this in perspective, today you get a radiation dose of about 3.1 millisieverts a year. With the faster time required by the young Earth, that dose would become 3,200 millisieverts, an increase of 1,000 times. But wait, there's more, because that's what the dose is today. But if you go back in time to the 7,000 years when Adam and Eve were supposedly walking around, you'd have even more fissile material, which means more radiation. At that point, it would have been 147,000 times as radioactive, yielding an annual dose of about 13,500 millisieverts, 273 times the safe dose. Over their 900 years of life, Adam and Eve were probably very well acquainted with every possible form of cancer. But wait, there's more. Because to avoid this, some creationists have suggested that perhaps it all happened during the flood. Maybe that's what covered it all. Well, the flood lasted less than half a year. If you thought that compressing all of that decay into 7,000 years was bad, try compressing it into 150 days. That bumps the radioactivity up to 2.06 billion times as radioactive. Being exposed to that level of radiation for a single hour would be fatal several times over, and they'd be getting it all day, every day, for half a year. Clearly, compressing the timeline won't work. Oklo alone pushes the timeline back 1.7 billion years. So by now, I'm sure everyone listening is convinced, but I'm going to keep going anyway. So, radiometric dating. Some atoms or isotopes in nature are unstable because they have too many or too few neutrons. So these atoms will decay. They emit some particle and become something else, another atom, another isotope. The decayed atom is called the parent. The new one is called the daughter, not the son for whatever reason. The speed and type of decay depends on the particular isotope. The process is intrinsically random. You can't predict when a particular atom will decay, but when you have billions of atoms, you can make very accurate predictions about how fast they'll decay on average. Just like you can't predict the single roll of the dice, but you can very accurately predict what the average roll will be over 1 million rolls. Since we know how long it takes for a parent to decay, we can measure the ratio of parent to daughter and infer the age of the sample. It's a clock that occurs in nature. And that's the process we call radiometric dating. There are several different methods. Each has their own particular process, their own assumptions. Some constants are the half-life needs to be constant throughout the age. We already talked about that. That's definitely secure. The original ratio of parent to daughter needs to be inferred. That's made easier if the sample has been isolated over its whole life, but sometimes that can be overcome. I don't have a ton of time, so I'm just going to look at 2 methods, starting with uranium-lead. So lead-204 is non-radiogenic. That means it's not the result of radioactive decay. It comes with the world. So the amount of lead-204 you have tells you how much lead you had overall in the sample at the beginning. Lead-207 and 206, on the other hand, come from the decay of uranium-235 and 238, respectively. So in uranium-lead dating, geologists look at crystals called zircons. They measure the ratio of daughter lead to its parent uranium, and then you just solve for the age of the zircon. You even get a little bit of a self-check because there's 2 different decay paths. If the 2 ages agree, that gives you some confidence that the system was in isolation the whole time. It's very unlikely that those 2 would just agree randomly if you were just picking random numbers. Even if intrusions occurred, geologists have determined ways to get around that by examining multiple crystals in the area. The exact solution, the Concordia-Discordia intersections, is a bit complicated, and I can get into that if people want me to. But suffice it to say, it's a known problem with a known solution. This method has been used to date zircon crystals to millions and billions of years of age. One more type before we close this part out, potassium-argon. In another method, potassium-argon, potassium-40, which is a metal, decays into argon-40, which is a gas. When present in lava, that's where you find this stuff, the gas will leave because the lava is liquid. That's called outgassing. At the moment of cooling, when it becomes a crystal, the argon can't escape anymore, and then it'll start to build up. Measure how much argon-40 you have, and that tells you how long since the cooling happened. Now, there is a catch. There are some argon, floating about, being spewed out by the volcano or whatever. And some of it is captured, a little bit of it is captured when the crystallization happens. This is called inherited argon. This is especially the case if the lava was under a lot of pressure and the gas couldn't leave as easily. The effect of this then would make the crystal look older than what it really is. But it's flawed. But whatever gas there was at the beginning, what that would do is it would add a flat number of years to the effective age that you'd get from the dating. And in other words, it would give you a static amount of air. Well, how much air? Fortunately, we can empirically test that by going to lava flows whose age is known and seeing what age we get with this test. In 1969, McDougall et al. Found lava flows known to be less than 1,000 years old, and they had a potassium-argon age of 465,000 years. Now, that may seem super bad, but suppose that you had a sample that had 1 billion years worth of argon built up in it. That sample would have the same amount of argon when it was captured, that 465,000. So of the argon you saw, 465,000 years of it would be the air. But that means the rock is still 999.5 million years old. That's an error of 0.04%, which is pretty darn good. So how do we know these methods work? Well, as I mentioned, each method measures different isotopes with different decay mechanisms, and they measure them all differently. If the methods agree then, within margins of error, of course, then we know they're valid. One great example of that is in the Manson meteorite impact on the Pierre Shale, which created crystals when it struck the ground. The meteorite was dated with a variety of methods by no fewer than 8 labs. All of them gave the same date within margins of error of 74.1 million years. Another example, the Amitsoq-Nisus in Greenland has been dated using rubidium-strontium dating, lead-lead dating, uranium-lead, and lutetium-hafnium. That's at least 4 different methods that I could find in some quick Googling by a variety of labs over decades. And all of those results from all of those different methods gave you an age of between 3.6 and 3.75 billion years. Over and over again, multiple methods by multiple people have yielded the same result. If the methods were bunk, we wouldn't expect this level of agreement. A variety of methods agree because the methods work. Now, that's not to say they're perfect. They have limitations and they have error. Not every method is applicable to every situation. That's just the way real life works. But at the very least, this has demonstrated the Earth is far older than what the creationists claim.
1 minute.
So my time is almost up, and I've barely scratched the surface. So there's there's the entire theory of evolution, not to mention all the flaws in the flood, et cetera, and I hope we'll get around to that. But I hope I've at least given you some of the reasons why I changed my mind. I just want to be clear. I am not a physicist. I am not a biologist. I'm not any kind of scientist. I'm just an engineer. So please check me. I'll be posting my sources afterwards. And if you see an objection raised by Ken Ham or Eric Hovind that points out some supposed flaw in modern scientific understanding, what I want you to do is not say, aha, that's ridiculous. How can they believe that? Instead, ask the question. That seems ridiculous. Is that really what they believe? And if so, why? What do they know that I don't? And then go find out what it is.
All right. Thank you very much. So we are now going to get into the 10-minute rebuttals. Has the affirmative decided who is going to start with the rebuttal, or how you're going to break up the time?
Yep. So we got 10 minutes. I'll go the first 10 or the first 5. Give me a minute warning like you did before, Nick.
Sure.
This will be easier. Once I'm at 5, let me know, and Matt can take over the last 5.
Oh, well, so once, yeah, okay. I'll give you a minute warning, and then, yeah, sounds good. All right, whenever you're ready.
Awesome. Okay, so it looks like Jordan here just wants to attack a young Earth with assumption-based methods, but we're here using genetics. We're using straightforward mutation rates, and even the evolutionist, the uniformitarian, will use, for example, he's looking at radioactive dating, radioactive clocks. He's looking at the rocks, and he's trying to disprove a biblical base model. But when we actually look to genetics, traits, genes are inherited. And when we trace that back, we come right to a female ancestor, a male ancestor, 3 major haplogroups. We can see that genetics are going down. Genetic degeneration is exactly what we observe. So therefore, since we're defending Genesis and we are really utilizing genetics to prove flawlessly that science does support a literal interpretation of Genesis, we're going to have to discuss that in detail in the discussion. I will touch on his radioactive dating methods. Now, he did say at the end there, they do have limitations, they do have error, and this is a fact. Age isn't really measured. Rather, as he hinted at and he talked about here in his opening, certain processes and amounts of materials are measured, and then age is inferred. The fact that radiometric ages for rocks of known ages do turn out to be so seriously inaccurate is a strong suggestion that one or more of these assumptions is, of course, incorrect. He did talk about it in detail, and he is right. Secularists, uniformitarians, for example, they measure the amount of the radioactive parent and the daughter isotopes in the present. Here's the problem, and here's where the assumptions come into play, because they're making a whole host of unprovable naturalistic assumptions. Then they extrapolate backwards in time to make what is essentially a guess about an age. They assume uniformitarianism, the present is the key to the past. 2 Peter 3 says that in the last days there's going to be scoffers denying 3 things: the creation, the global flood, and the coming judgment. The fact that he rejects and scoffs at the global flood and then uses these radioisotope dating methods to prove his worldview and to prove his position speaks directly of 2 Peter 3. There is substantial evidence for a global flood. I mean, just to name a few, we find whole rock layer sequences deposited rapidly in quick succession. We see flat, featureless boundaries. We see rapid or no erosion between sediment layers. How does he explain all this? Look at the walls of the Grand Canyon, for example. From the Tepites at the bottom to the Kaibab limestone at the top, it's supposed to be representing the 300 million years of slow and gradual sedimentary deposition that he talks about. But when the plateau was pushed up, those rock layers were bent and folded, but they were folded without fracturing. They had to be soft if they were bent without fracturing, of course. How does he explain this? And I did ask some questions to him regarding genetics, the 3 major haplogroups in my opening. So I hope he answers those in his rebuttal. But what all this means is that they could have only just been deposited. This means the 300 millions of years that he's trying to push never happened. All those rock layers had to be rapidly deposited in quick succession in the flood year. He talked about Francis Collins, the language of God, and how this changed his mind. Well, at the end of the day, Francis Collins and Biologos and the arguments used in this book have all been thoroughly debunked and addressed, of course. Some of the arguments that Francis Collins uses is his belief that humans and chimpanzees and other forms of life share genetic mistakes. I'd love to talk about this with Jordan in the discussion period, what he might know as pseudogenes. And at the end of the day, these pseudogenes, they now appear to be functional DNA elements and not mistakes. There's a scientist from Biologos who's associated with Francis Collins named Dr. Vanima. He likes to use the example and tell people that humans possess the broken remnants of an ancient chicken gene. And no such remnant actually exists. Instead, the fragment appears to be a functional DNA element. They'll go into the genetic identity, which Francis Collins, I believe, says is about 98 to 99%. But at the end of the day, new incoming data has revealed that the actual genetic identity is only 88%. That's 400 million DNA differences that exist between the two species. They'd love to talk about human chromosome number 2 as well. Francis Collins and those at Biologos. Is that 5 minutes? Okay, give me 30 seconds to finish my thought here. They like to push the human chromosome number 2, which they'll say, Francis Collins will say that occurred through the fusion of 2 ape-like chromosomes. That's been overturned. The purported fusion site is now actually known to be a functional DNA element in a human gene. Junk DNA era has been overturned. All the testable and future predictions are coming from Creationists. I want to say one last point on his radioactive clocks and radioactive dating, because he spent his entire 12 minutes on that. He definitely has a lot to address from myself and Matt's presentation. But if God instantly created trees, for example, and then we analyze this, the leaves would have chlorophyll, as leaves do today, of course. But it didn't come by normal processes. This is what Jordan doesn't understand. So when God made the first rocks, they had atoms in them. Let's talk about genetic. Let's talk about what's measurable, what's testable, what we can make predictions on, not the assumption-based method like he's using. If we come along later and say that lead must have come from decay of uranium, because he talked about this form of dating method, therefore we will use that to date the rock. You'd be wrong, of course, as there would be lead there to begin with. So why shouldn't there be? Therefore, let's stick to the genetics and how it proves a literal interpretation of Genesis. Go ahead, Matt.
All right, you got 3:40 left.
Okay. All right. Awesome. I don't know if you've seen our flood video, Jordan. I hope you did. That would have been fun. Okay. Well, all right. Regarding your opening then. I'm sure you've stated it, that the newly expelled lava that comes from varying amounts of both parent and daughter isotopes, but the pre-existing daughter isotopes do not all boil out of lava before solidification of into igneous rock or indigenous rock occurs. So when testing like modern rocks, we know that those rocks formed from observation. We can see this from lava, right? But the daughter isotope percentages at formation vary widely and are in fact never zero. So if they're never zero, and if the daughter isotope levels at rocks formation in modern observed samples vary, then one must accept that the rocks from the past acted like that in the same manner. So if the starting ratios are not known, then there is no math that can find the date. The dates that are used and accepted by supporters of deep time are in fact nothing but guesses based off of this assumption. So this is why we really like biology, because you can observe the numbers in real time. You can look at mutation rates in trio studies and watch them occurring. And you can do this with these dating methods that you have, but they take such a long amount of time that they say, well, you can't actually test anything within 10,000 years for radioisotope dating because it takes such a long amount of time. Right? I saw the roll of eyes. My bad. I shouldn't be watching you. Okay. Well, regardless, God made and created rocks that the earth is a part of. So think about it. If you were to test Adam the day he was born, how old would he have been? Standing for Truth said, if you were to test a tree that was in the garden, how old were they? But we know that trees take years to grow and years to bear fruit, but the tree was only 2 days old. So it wouldn't have actually been very accurate. We believe in special creation. So if the earth was molten volcanic rocks for eons, and we know that volcanic rocks that are tested have huge dating errors in them, and in fact, again, we would say that they never had zero isotopes. Thus, all accurate dating methods would be invalid. So one would have to rely on dating methods of rocks to disprove all the other data that was given. That's why you're just looking at one piece of a puzzle to refute everything else, when we need to kind of step back and look at everything and see how the puzzle fits it together and look at the overall picture. That's why we're kind of bringing everything to the table. So unfortunately, it was kind of a bombardment in the beginning. We kind of threw a lot at you. He probably gave you 5 or 6 or 8 different things. I gave you 5, maybe 6. So I know it's a lot. You gave us just rocks. So, I mean, I'm sure you'll want to touch on that more, but that's kind of why we trust that very much, because every time lava has been tested and those rocks that are formed from these lava, the dates are all over the place. And creationists love that too, because it's inaccurate. So sorry, Nick, was that?
No, you still got 30 seconds left, but Jordan ended 30 early too, so it's
okay. Then
works out if it works out.
Jump into discussion. That's fine.
All right, let's do the discussion. So,
don't
Jordan
I get 10 minutes?
Rebuttal time. Don't worry, you're going to get your rebuttal, Jordan.
So it's a 30 minutes open discussion, and
no, Jordan still has his 10-minute rebuttal.
Oh Jesus, I'm so sorry. That was almost a problem. Yeah, Jordan, you don't really want to rebut. I mean, you know what? They were so good. Do you just want to call it a night and head home?
I think my argument was self-evident. So
okay, my sincerest apologies. You've got 10 minutes whenever you're ready.
All right, so like Matt said, they did throw a lot at me, so I'm going to just kind of go through it. First off, the question should not be, could God have done this? Because the answer to that's always going to be yes. I mean, he's God, he can do whatever he wants. But instead, the question is, what's the simplest explanation? Not meaning the one that takes the fewest words to say, but the one that has the fewest ad hoc assumptions, the one that makes the best sense of the data without stretching, etc. So just keep that in mind as we go on. They mentioned about information being on a downward decline, how it can't be generated by natural selection. New information can, in fact, be generated by mutations. It's not necessarily a downward spiral. Just one example of that would be a gene duplication and frame shift, where a gene or even a whole genome, if it's small enough, can be duplicated. So you have an extra set, and then you shift one of the bases. So the bases code a specific amino acid, which collectively make a protein. If you drop one of those letters, then every place from then on makes a different amino acid, which means a different protein. You have a protein that wasn't being made before, completely new genetic information, so you can definitely add information. And how could that be selected? Well, if it doesn't work very well, the thing that made it will die, and it won't make kids. So natural selection. Let's see. Was there a beginning? That is not necessarily a settled question. There was certainly a beginning to our observable universe at the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago. However, it's not yet clear whether that was the absolute beginning. You've got the Carroll-Chen model. You've got several other cosmological models that work just fine with today's physics and have an eternal universe. So that's not a settled question. You may get into more physics hopefully later. But anyway, I'd need a citation for the languages arising on their own. There wasn't much there. So if we all came from Noah, I'd be interested how you deal with the genetic bottlenecking. You can see genetic bottlenecking whenever there's an extinction level event. That is cheetahs. Cheetahs are very genetically similar to each other, even if they're not related, like not brother, sister, cousin, that sort of thing. They're so genetically similar to each other that one cheetah can take a skin graft from another cheetah and it won't reject it. And that sounds like a good idea, and maybe it is if all you're worried about is skin grafts. But that leaves you very open to infection, to infant mortality, to all kinds of bad things. Genetic diversity is a good thing. Well, if that's how bad it gets when you have a small bottlenecking with one species. Why don't we see this kind of problem if we bottlenecked everything down to 2 individuals, or in the case of Noah, I forget, it's like 10 or 12 or whatever. But in any case, that would be a problem, something that you would observe that we don't observe. It's funny that they don't allow evolution to work over geological timescales, like over the billions of years that natural selection is supposed to have been working. But it's supposed to go super fast for the last 4,000 years. Like, which is it? Is evolution too slow, or is it fast enough? Like, you can't have it both ways. So they mentioned that I was attacking their model with assumption-based methods. Well, I'm attacking it with physics because physics is what I know. I'm a nuclear engineer, so that's just where my wheelhouse is. So let's get into that. Let's see. And also, physics is just better than biology, so there's another reason. So you asserted that dating methods are, quote, seriously inaccurate, but I think where that's coming from, and you'll have to tell me in the discussion, there are errors, and sometimes they sound really big. Like if you had, for instance, I saw an age earlier for a rock that was like 1.08 billion years, and it was plus or minus like 30 million years. 30 million years, you're not even close. Well, I mean, you're not that close compared to the billion years. Like you have to get, there is error, but you have to compare it to the total age. So even though 30 million years might seem like a lot compared to a billion years, it's not that big a deal. You spent a little bit of time talking about there being zero of the daughter isotopes when it was created, or there never is zero. That's fine. There are certain methods like lead-lead dating where the initial chemical composition is just not even important because the amount of lead 204, which is not radiogenic, that tells you how much lead was there originally. So you have the initial composition in terms of percentages. Sure, if some of the lead was carried away, that's also not a problem because isotopes are chemically identical. So anything that would carry one isotope away will carry all of the isotopes away. So that's why they deal with ratios and not total amounts usually. So yeah, that is not a problem. And for some things like the potassium argon, like I mentioned, you don't get a complete outgassing. The kind of naive freshman version of it is that they assume that there's zero daughter, but in actual fact, they know that there's not zero daughter. That's something they just have to account for, and it's part of the error. So that's part of why when you get to the bounds of detectability in a radiometric dating method, it gets less and less accurate. That's because of that error. So the argon that was trapped when it crystallized, all that would do is add some hundreds of thousands, heck, say millions. You can even say hundreds of millions. That's fine because the age that they get is 4.5 billion years. So no matter how big the error you want to stretch it to, it's still way more than 7,000 years, which invalidates the model. There are some methods that can be dated within 10,000 years, carbon-14 being the biggest one. Argon, I think, can be done within a couple hundred years. The reason that you have these bands, it's not like one of the accusations I commonly hear is that, well, you decide what the age is ahead of time, and then you pick the model based on that, or pick the method based on that. That's just not the case. The reason that we say they have these bands of accuracy is because that's dependent on how fast or slow the genetic material or the radiometric material decays. So the reason that carbon-14 dating isn't any good after 50,000 years is just because there's no carbon left. You know, it's not any kind of grand conspiracy. And that kind of brings me to, you're talking about being created with the appearance of age. When I was a creationist, that was my favorite thing. Well, it doesn't matter what the radiometric dating says because God just made the earth look old. Adam was old when he was created, you know, he made everything good, etc. That strikes me like you're saying God is a liar, which seems like a strange thing for a Christian to say. I already addressed the initial composition, so that's not a problem, which means in order to get the things that we see, it's not an assumption, it's not a guess, we are making inferences based on natural laws and predictable patterns, which is exactly the same thing you do in any other science, biology included. So in order for us to get what we observe today, if the universe is in fact 7, 6, 10,000 years old, it would mean that God would have to have created everything to include the radiogenic isotopes with the appearance that they had been there from the beginning. As if it had age, it would be completely indistinguishable from something that was 4.5 billion years. I mean, in that case, sure, but he could have also made it 10 minutes ago and given us all the memories that we have. It's a model that gets you nowhere. Yes, God could do that because he can do anything, but that isn't the simplest way to explain the evidence. See, I have 2.5 minutes left?
Yes, sir.
No erosion between the layers. I'm not sure why there'd be erosion marks between the layers. I'm not a geologist, so Maybe you can enlighten me on that. But if you accept the premise that these are being laid down, in most cases, not for every case, there's some layers of rock that are laid down quite fast, but for most layers of rock, it takes thousands or even millions of years. I'm not sure why you'd expect to see erosion marks between the layers. They would just be filled in gradually over time. How do you get that kind of bending without fracturing? Slowly and carefully, same way you bend anything without fracturing. So you only would expect to see fracturing if you tried to crack this huge rock layer really fast, like you'd get in the flood, I suppose, unless the flood also heats things up. I'm not sure what the point was there, but the fracturing isn't a problem for deep age, as you called it. Let's see. I don't know anything about the different genetic family types. I've never heard that before, so I guess I won't respond to that because I wouldn't have anything meaningful to say. Oh, the rib. So this one is a little weird too. It's a prediction, so to speak, of creationism, that they pick the only bone that can regenerate in mammals. Isn't that amazing? Well, what other bone were they supposed to pick? Like, was he gonna like rip off the guy's arm and make a life? Like rip off his like take a spine out like some guy in Mortal Kombat? I don't know what the other option was. Like it's the only one there. And besides, who cares if it can regenerate? You've got God. He can just boom. There's your rib back. Like it's the fact that it can regenerate is a complete coincidence. It doesn't tell you anything. I'd rather just get to the discussion, so I'll just forfeit the rest of the time.
All right. Sounds good. So now, assuming I haven't like completely robbed anybody of their
but what about second breakfast?
What about second? Exactly. All right. So a 30-minute discussion. Is there anyone in particular who I assume the affirmative probably wants to begin the discussion? Is there anything you guys would like to start on?
Well, thanks for being so polite there, Nick. Yeah, I've got a couple questions to ask regarding what he talked about in his rebuttal, because he did bring up a couple new things and a couple points against our opening. So yeah, I could ask a couple questions.
All right. Well, then it's all yours.
Lay it on me.
Okay, I appreciate your opening and your rebuttal there, Jordan. I did want to comment. I got some stuff written down. Hopefully we can touch on it all. Obviously, you brought some more stuff up on the age of the Earth. You brought up duplications, frame shift mutations as a way to add new information, new novel information. But you did ask a specific question that how do we deal with the bottleneck from our biblical-based position? Because so it looks like you at least understood our argument correctly in the fact that if we only started with two people, as Genesis would say that God created Adam and Eve, well, what does that do? Jordan, it restricts the diversity today. So from the biblical model, we all come from just two people. That's what we're defending here, right? Is science consistent with Genesis? That means that limited diversity is easy to explain. And the Bible predicted this, but you're talking about a bottleneck. Mm-hmm. For one, the evolutionary bottleneck hypothesis that you would have to resort to from a uniformitarian based worldview. Can you explain to me how that would be even remotely feasible and empirical? And then I can explain to you why ours is empirical and feasible. Go ahead.
Sure. You can look at Dating the Genetic Bottleneck of the African Cheetah by Minotti, Raymond, and O'Brien in 1993 from PNAS. You can look that up. That's a peer-reviewed paper that documents this phenomenon in cheetahs. You can observe the genetic bottlenecking by the genetic similarity between different cheetahs, the lack of diversity. That's what happens in a bottleneck. And the problems with that are documented in Genetic Basis for Species Vulnerability in the Cheetah, Science Volume 227 by O'Brien et al. So that's where the empirical data is. Basically, if you're asking me how it works, if you only have so many people, there's only so much genetic diversity, like you were saying, there's a limited diversity over short time scales. You could eventually create that diversity back up if you were given enough time, I suppose. I'm not a biologist, but over short time scales, it makes you undiverse. It's why inbreeding is a problem, and it's just that on a population level.
Right. So I appreciate that answer there. I am glad you brought up the cheetahs because I think there's, you seem to know a lot about it. I think there's approximately 10,000 or so cheetahs left. Mm-hmm. And conservationists, they're looking to keep them from going extinct, obviously due to this genetic bottleneck where I think there's the exposing of recessive mutations. I mean, we're seeing some pretty significant genetic damage in these cheetah populations. And that's why I believe that the evolutionary bottleneck hypothesis that you'd have to look to and that you're talking about here, I don't believe that it's feasible, because that, I would call it a rescue device. And why I would is because it would involve an extended near extinction event associated with severe inbreeding and severe genetic damage, just like we're seeing with the cheetah populations. Now, our position, and then obviously you can respond to that, but real quick, I want to answer your question. Based on the evolutionary perspective that you're holding to, and then the evolutionary worldview, the human genetic homogeneity, it remains a very serious theoretical problem. But with our perspective in the biblical-based model, there's absolutely no problem. And I'll tell you why. Is because according to the biblical-based model, we started with just 2 people, okay? And then 10 generations later, we have a second single generation bottleneck of what? Just 8 people. And this occurred at the time of Noah. Now, what's important here, Jordan, is that both bottlenecks were very brief, okay? For example, just 1 generation, and then explosive growth was followed by this. And in both cases, there would be almost no previously accumulated mutations, and therefore no inbreeding effects. But your explanation, the very limited genetic diversity we see, it still remains a huge problem, and I haven't seen you give an empirical answer. All I see is unrestrained storytelling. In the cheetah example that you gave, I don't think it helps your story. I think it helps us see that the story is not even remotely feasible. Go ahead.
I don't know why you'd need an extended bottlenecking event to get the problem. Once you restrict the population to a small amount, 2 would be way smaller than you need for the problem. Why is it that having a brother mate with a sister would be magically okay and wouldn't cause any kind of genetic issues if it happened 4,000 years ago?
Well, I'm saying your bottleneck would be prolonged. Our bottleneck is not prolonged. That's why the evolutionary bottleneck hypothesis, which involves an extended and lengthy near extinction event, right? You understand that it does involve a lengthy and extended near extinction event. That hypothesis is associated with severe inbreeding. That's why it's not even remotely feasible. It's not empirical, but the empirical data and scientific evidence supports our bottleneck of Adam and Eve, which was not prolonged. And also, there wouldn't have been any accumulated mutations. What do we inherit? 100 new mutations per person per generation. Take that back to a point of least genetic entropy, least genetic accumulation, Jordan. That would be a time of perfection, just as talked about and as we can read in Genesis. There's no inbreeding problem, but with you guys there is an inbreeding problem. So can you explain to us how to solve this very serious theoretical problem? Because you're going to have to address and critique our position. Go ahead.
There's no problem. I really don't understand what it is you're trying to get at. That yes, it is true that the bottleneck for the cheetah is an extended event, but that's just because that's how populations work in real life. That's just what would have actually happened here. I don't understand why that is mitigated if you just make it more severe. If you just make the problem more severe, I don't know why that mitigates it, but I think we're just kind of going round and round on that. I think that if you get down to 2 people, you're going to have some bottlenecking issues. You say you won't because, whatever.
Well, we have studies where things have gone into just 2s, but regarding the bottleneck, the supposed bottleneck that brought forth primitive man going in and modern day man coming out was supposedly 200,000 years ago, but there's no evidence in the geologic column for that event actually occurring. So that's a strange one. And then we have the deer that got let loose, for example. There were only 2 of them. They got let loose on New Zealand. Today, they're the most populated species that's there. They have to kill them just to get rid of them. Now they're more of a nuisance. They took 2 sheep and they put them on the Kruligan Islands, and within just 40 years, there were 700 of them. There was no problem with genetic diversity with these things. And these are only just 2 sheep where they know the numbers, and they diversify no problem whatsoever without any genetic problems whatsoever. So against what evolutionary theory says, you need a bottleneck of at least 25 to repopulate a land and everything. Well, we have multiple examples where that is now, and that hasn't been an issue whatsoever.
Do you have a citation for either of those events?
So go ahead.
Do you have a citation for either of those events?
Oh yeah, sure.
Just
yeah,
post it afterwards.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
I can't speak to it because I'm not a biologist and I haven't seen those studies. So, I don't have anything to say.
All right.
I don't want to speak outside of my expertise.
I don't want to jump in real quick. I'll let Matt finish his thought, but I just want to point out to the audience who's listening, the debate would be, is Genesis consistent with empirical scientific data? Now, in regards to Adam and Eve, which obviously we can read of in Genesis, God created two people. What do we see? Low genetic diversity among any two people on this planet. Somebody from Asia and me over here in North America, we're no more than 0.1% different. Therefore, that's what we would predict. Now, very limited human genetic diversity. It's as we can see here, because you don't have an answer to it. It's a huge problem for your position in evolutionary theory. I'm almost done. And it leads to unrestrained storytelling, as you're proving here. Now, at the end of the day, the evolution story as well, it still needs to be revised almost monthly, almost yearly, just to explain all this genetic related data. So the point is, limited, human genetic diversity, it's obviously compatible with the biblical perspective and a literal interpretation of Genesis, and that's the title of this debate. And it doesn't require any far-fetched mental invention. So why throw out a perfectly good Bible for a theory, like, for example, I wouldn't even call it a theory, like evolutionary theory, the idea that pine trees and whales are related through common ancestry, when there's no actual evidence for it? I mean, can you give us what's your best evidence for, I should ask you, do you believe that all life on Earth is related through common ancestry, right? Banana plants, pine trees, whales, dogs, are they all related according to your belief system? Go ahead.
You and a cabbage are a very distant cousin.
Right. So
well, there were a lot of questions there. Do we maybe want to give Jordan about 10 minutes because you guys took about 10 minutes worth of questions. So I'd like to give Jordan some time to answer a number of them here.
So, I'd like to ask them too, but let me try to rapid fire through this.
Ask some, I think, yes.
Yeah. So the genetic diversity that we see across the planet, our species hasn't been around that long in terms of geological time. The species supposedly came about somewhere between 100 and 250,000 years, depending on which biologist you ask. So the lack of genetic diversity fits that model. It's not a distinguishing factor. Something that is a distinguishing factor would be genetic diversity as a result of a point location from the flood. So since we're on the subject of genetic diversity, if Noah grabbed everything that was alive on the ark and landed at one point and then let everything go, that's what your model says, right? I just want to make sure I'm not mischaracterizing before.
Well, he probably didn't have to grab everything. He might have left some things behind, but yeah.
Okay, so the vast majority of things were on the ark. That's how it survived. And then he released them from a point. Why don't we see genetic diversity dropping off from that radiating point? And also, why do we see the grouping? So did the penguins, when they got off the ark, just troop along like soldiers all the way to the South Pole and no one thought that Australia was nice? What was the disciplinary effect that's caused these animals to group together after the flood?
What is that saying? Something of a feather flock together. We know that some things travel very good in groups. They like to stick together, kind of like humans do. We migrate together and we diversify in different races, and then we stick to our races and we don't like others. It's just kind of how animals and humans tend to be like. And then we see that, matter of fact, you can Google right now or type into YouTube, there's a penguin that travels over 5,000 miles every single year to go visit somebody who saved him over in Brazil. So they could easily have traveled thousands and thousands of miles to get to where they're at today, because a single one does it for fun to go visit a guy. So transportation is pretty easy. And after the flood, we expect that there would have been more land bridges. Things would have moved and dissipated a little easier, because we know that the ocean levels were rising even still to this day. So if they had land to walk on, it would have been much easier than they have today. And we still know that they can do it today. So that's fascinating. Sorry.
What did everything eat while they were walking? All the plants were under salt water for 40 days. And supposedly it laid down all these layers of rock, right? So what did the flood do? Did it pick up all the rock, hold the topsoil over there for a second, lay down all the rock, then gently lay the topsoil down on all the plants? I don't understand what they would have eaten during this 1,000-mile trek.
Good question. Actually, Darwin wanted to know that answer himself. And what he did is he took seeds and he submerged them in salt water for a very long time. And he actually found that they would sprout even after being submerged in salt water over a year. And the ark wasn't for example, the ark itself, when it landed, they waited 3 months before they left the ark itself. So there's plenty of time for plants and things like that to actually grow for the animals to eat. Remember, a dove brought back a twig from an olive branch. So we know that there were months and months. Look at how fast an olive tree grows after 3 months. So are you going to say something?
Remember Carthage? Salted soil isn't great for plants to grow, and they'd have to grow pretty fast in order to fuel this 1,000-mile trek.
Well, we also have the fountains of the great deep that broke forth could have been fresh water that's underneath the ocean itself. And that's what flooded the earth, is the fountains of the great deep breaking forth. So like the icebergs that we have there today, that's fresh water. That's why they float. So the fresh water breaking forth is what formed and flooded the oceans. So it would have desalinated a lot of the oceans itself. So
which would have killed all the saltwater fish. I guess it sucks they didn't get a spot on the ark, huh?
That's their problem.
Yeah.
But
so you mentioned something that I kind of addressed, but I'd like to talk about it with you specifically, Matt, because you talked about the appearance of age, which I said when I was a creationist, that was one of my favorite things. Sure. So why would God create things with every appearance, in other words, indistinguishable from something that was 4.5 billion years old, with the radiometric isotopes, them existing in a closed environment? In other words, there's no test that we could run that would disprove that. So why is it that God would? It seems kind of deceptive to me. So maybe you can break that down.
Okay, well, remember, there's a lot of dating methods. Only a few really show old. But the fact is that I don't know if it naturally. People generally just assume it's old. Remember, most people that believed even in science earlier on still thought young Earth creation. When you pick up 2 rocks on the ground, you can't look at one and go, that's definitely older than the one that's in my other hand. So it has to be done scientifically. You have to look at the isotopes. So what we're doing is, when we're saying that, these different lava flows are giving different dates. When you go to the Grand Canyon, there's 2 different lava flows. The one that's multiple layers underneath the top layer shows massive discrepancies. The one that's on top shows that it's millions of years older, and yet even that dating is wrong, because they've actually recently found Indian pottery that from a tribe that lived there only 900 years ago, yet the lava flow is 300 million years old. So the dating methods we think are debunked because we constantly find a falsification and multiple errors that come from these things. We don't think that God's trying to trick us by throwing these numbers around. We just think that what's happening is that these isotopes are they formed during during the flood at this really rare occurrence. And
well, then how do you explain the fact that at that point it'd be Noah, that Noah and his family survived radioactive dosing that would have been thousands of times greater than standing next to the reactor at Chernobyl?
No problem. When you're because when you are standing there on the ark, these radioactive isotopes are forming in things like granite that are underneath the ocean from these tectonic plates and compression. And guess what? Even today, you can stand next to nuclear reactors that are under the ocean, literally 30 feet down, and the people are standing there without suits on because water protects you. Water
is an effective shield for alpha and beta rays. It's okay for gamma, but that doesn't protect you against the radioactive isotopes that are inside you right now, inside the food you eat, inside the wood of the ark, inside the animals, inside everything. And if everything is speeding up to, what was the number? I did the calculations earlier today. If it was 2 billion times as radioactive as it is today, how do they protect themselves from the potassium-40 that was in their bloodstream? What shielding did they have there?
Well, remember, we don't believe that they had these things before the flood. So these things would have been in the elements themselves after the flood.
So potassium-40 didn't exist before the flood, except it did because it was under in the rocks. But
remember, these certain rocks formed during that process. It was massive tectonic shifting. The continents moved from dramatic shifting very quickly. And
so there were no radioactive isotopes before the flood, just to be clear.
Right. Correct.
So radioactivity did not exist before the flood.
Right.
And then during the flood, radioactivity existed, but only under the ground, not in all the other places where these radioactive isotopes would be. I just want to be clear.
Well, no, they started forming in the ground during the tectonic shifting, during the compression, during that rare event when things were starting to compress. It's called the catastrophic plate tectonics. And that's why I was like, that's why I asked you in the beginning if you had seen our video, because it would have really helped. But that's our fault for not giving it to you.
So how did the potassium? I'm sorry. How did you eat potassium whenever you eat a banana? That banana did not go down miles under the earth to get the potassium-40 from the granite, which is where you're saying it came from. How did the banana get the potassium-40?
because at the end of the flood, during the formation of all the mountains, these things arose, and they finally had these new elements in the soil which weren't there before. So now they're just in the earth. They're like granite, you can tell us today, but it's not as damaging, right? So granite doesn't give it out enough. If you had a granite countertop, it wouldn't affect.
So it would have, you could detect it with a Geiger counter, but it's not dangerous anyway. No.
But bananas are much higher. Matter of fact, if you were to go through a machine, you would actually, it would go off. Your bananas would go off because of how much potassium, radioactive potassium there actually would be in that.
XKCD has this is an aside, but XKCD has an awesome chart that shows radioactivity in banana doses. So you can see like how much a reactor would be in bananas.
No good.
Yeah. I don't know. We can move on to a different topic. I don't want to dominate, but that seems like special pleading. You're saying, well, radioactivity didn't exist. Then it existed only where we'd be shielded under model, but not anywhere else where we observe it. And then afterwards, it just spewed everywhere. I guess that seems like you're really contorting in order to avoid the physics. I don't know how much more time we have left.
We are on about, I think we're on about 10 minutes. Hold on, sorry. We're on 11 minutes, and then we're going to do some super chats and stuff like that.
You took 10.
I want to jump in real quick because I think Matt's explanations are more than sufficient. I think your problem is the fact that you're rejecting a global flood to begin with, but I think you're underestimating the scope and scale of the energy produced by the flood, and the fact that when the fountains of the Great Deep are broken open, Jordan, and if you can imagine it, the Earth is fractured like an eggshell, right? The continents are moving vertically, they're moving horizontally. The tsunamis, they're driving flood waters onto the continents. The continents are moving at rapid paces through the flood waters. And I wanted to ask you about this before we move on to a couple other things you talked about. We do have a testable prediction that was confirmed. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. Matt did touch on it. The model is called catastrophic plate tectonics. And in this model, based on the fountains of the Great Deep breaking open, Jordan, the pre-flood ocean crust, it's dragged down, okay? It's dragged down in the mantle core. As you would know, that's called subduction process. Now, here's where the prediction came into play by Dr. John Baumgartner years and years ago, that the cold ocean crust, okay, according to this hypothesis, should still be cold since this occurred only thousands of years ago, even though, according to this model, it has descended into the deep hot mantle. We've actually we have seismic data from NASA. It has revealed, after the prediction was made, enormous slabs of cool rock under North America itself, but down in the core, it should still be warm. Now, this is confirmation of flood geology, just showing you that it's not just all ad hoc. So not only genetics, do we have future testable predictions? I noticed that you didn't have any explanation for the testable predictions on the three major haplogroups, and that's fine. But there's also testable predictions to be made on flood geology. That's why Matt's explanations there flow from a hypothesis that's derived from Genesis, which actually has consistent and inaccurate predictions. So how do you explain all that, and why would you deny that to begin with? Go take as much time as you need.
I need to see the thermodynamic calculations in order to talk like how cold the slab would be. Without the calculations in front of me, I can't really say. I will say that a large heat transfer is dependent on surface area. The larger surface area thing you have, the more heat transfer you're going to have. But I'd have to see the calculations to know whether or not it'd be feasible.
Let's give Jordan a bit more time, because I think you guys have had about 20 to 40% more time than him. So I'd like to.
So talking about testable predictions, though, it seems like you're picking the predictions that fit your model, but ignoring all of the rest of the predictions, because the model makes predictions, a lot of them, not just the ones you're picking. So, for example, you've got predictions about how canyons will be formed, right? Like the Grand Canyon, you say the flood creates the Grand Canyon. Is that correct?
Yes. With that, the flood would
created things like the Grand Canyon that came from the flood.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in that case, the prediction you'd have is that we would see a shape in the Grand Canyon similar to we see it like Mount St. Helens, for example, or when dams burst. You've got a lot of inertia. This water has a lot of kinetic energy, and what kinetic energy and inertia doesn't like to do is change directions. That's basic physics. And so when you've got the Grand Canyon, instead of a straight blasted line like you'd expect from this massive flood, that would be the prediction, you instead get this winding river. So the flood would have had to come in screaming hot and then make a turn and then go screaming hot again and then make a U-turn. So why is it we see these kind of weird winding things, which is what you'd get from a plane that was being raised and then weathered down, but not what one would expect from a catastrophic flood?
Well, so first off, you mentioned Mount St. Helens. Yes, we would say Grand Canyon was formed from the flood, probably after the flood, whether it was weeks after the flood. But what have we learned from the eruption at Mount St. Helens, which is actually an observable event? Okay, and it's also a small scale event compared to the worldwide event of Noah's flood, of course, where the Grand Canyon would have been formed then. Obviously, we didn't see it. This is a thing of the past. But Mount St. Helens did demonstrate that sedimentary layers, which are hundreds of feet thick, I believe it is, could be laid down in hours to days, that canyons can be formed rapidly, and how multiple fossilized forests could form as the result of a single volcanic eruption.
That didn't answer the question.
Well, my question would be, the Grand Canyon is a thing of the past, but we can look at something observed like Mount St. Helens and see that these canyons can be formed rapidly versus the uniformitarian explanation for something like the Grand Canyon.
You still haven't answered the question. The question was, why do we see the shape of the Grand Canyon that we do when we know what happens when you have high inertia, massive catastrophic events, and that is not the shape we see? There's a prediction of what the shape of the Grand Canyon would be. Observations do not match that. Why?
Well, I would have to say that take the Grand Canyon. It's like a rift. It's like something opened up, right? It fractured. We don't know if it was a pull apart or when the continents hit and ruptured this area open. But what it is water always finds the lowest point. So we know that if it was carved, we would find millions of metric tons of rock from that being carved away downstream at some delta. But those rocks aren't anywhere. So they must have been removed during the receding waters of the flood. So whether or not the water was helping form the canyon later from something, sure, no problem. But there's no way that it could have formed that entire thing based on that, because we would find the evidence of those rocks slowly corroding that canyon away, right?
Yeah, I mean, it would be carried away, but there are geological processes that can deal with the missing Grand Canyon and whatnot. So basically what I'm hearing is that there's no answer for the curving thing.
Well, no, I think an answer was given, and I think, unfortunately, your basic assumption of uniformitarian processes is hindering you from understanding the explanation. But as Nick said, we do have limited time here. I do want to jump into
one more thing, just to even up the time real quick. You mentioned the catastrophic flood creating the radioactive isotopes. Is that something that God simply, spoke or whatever and made it happen? Or is that a physical process that you're saying the flood did it?
Physical process.
Okay, what is that physical process? Sorry, I didn't mean to jump on you. Go ahead.
No, of the radioactive elements being formed?
Yes.
I believe that they formed from the types of rock that were underneath the surface, from the pressure that was happening. See, what happened is we believe that the moon was going around and pulling and tugging on the surface of the waters and all of the mantle. And what happened is the water that was under the crust of the earth couldn't take this anymore. So it broke. And when it broke, the pressure from that water forced everything down. And during this forcing down, massive amounts of pressure was building up and creating these new elements to form. Very hot water creating new elements to form. And they do this to this day. They actually form new elements from this process.
You think that the pressure of the water was enough to spark nuclear fusion?
Right.
That's ridiculous.
I don't think it's ridiculous. I think in 2 Peter 3, when it says that the scoffers in the last day are willingly ignorant, I've given you testable, confirmed predictions based on the flood model. I do want to ask you, though, because you did talk about how The Language of God by Francis Collins convinced you that evolutionary theory is true.
Well, one point. It's not that that's convinced me. It started me on the road. I can see where you got that. That's not.
Okay.
It was a start. Go ahead. Continue.
No problem. I appreciate that. You mentioned natural selection acting upon, random variation, random mutations. You said mutations could add new information. But what we know about mutations, Jordan, is that they're overwhelmingly they cause corruption, loss of biological information. And the fact that these low impact deleterious mutations are accumulating in our genome and degenerating our information systems, do you have a type of selection that would be able to stop that degeneration in order to take your fish to fisherman to begin with?
I would dispute the basic premise that the mutations are accumulating at a deleterious rate, so a rate that would be impossible for selection to adjust to.
Do you know approximately what the human mutation rate is currently, according to scientific consensus?
Not off the top of my head, no.
So it is roughly 60 to 100. Some even say 130 to 150 new mutations per person per generation. So that would indicate, Jordan, that mutations are entering the human population at a rate much faster than natural selection could ever possibly select away such mutations. As you know, neutral mutations, for example, they're not acted upon by natural selection because they're invisible to natural selection. So these mutations that build up, how does natural selection remove them would be my question.
If they're neutral, there's no need to remove them.
How much of the genome would you say is functional on a percentage wise?
I'm not a biologist. I couldn't give a percentage.
Well, incoming data is suggesting that the trajectory is favoring genome-wide functionality. Therefore, these neutral mutations that you say are completely neutral, they're better referred to as nearly neutral. That means there's a tiny fitness effect. The best way I could make you understand it, Jordan, is that we have a genome, right, of 3 billion letters. So if you take out one letter or change one letter randomly, are you going to have a huge fitness effect? No, just like you said, the neutral mutations, they don't have a huge fitness effect. But it is going to have a tiny fitness effect. That's the problem. And it's like rust on a car, Jordan. You can't see each rust event, but it's continuous and destructive. Here's the problem. If you don't have an explanation or a resolution to that mutation accumulation problem, you're never going to be able to take your fish to fishermen, and you're never going to be able to convince us empirically that pine trees and whales are related through common ancestry. So do you have an answer for this problem of genomic degeneration?
You're assuming that mutations are only one direction. You're assuming that no mutation could ever be reversed by the same process by which it was expanded. So the math is going to be far more complex than you get 100 per, you multiply out by generations, boom, you get your number. That's just not how nature works. It's not that neat. You'd have to read a biology textbook. I'm not a biologist, so I can't specifically say what mechanisms there are. That's not my field of expertise. But what I will say is that the picture is not as simple as the simplistic one you're drawing.
All right, and I'm actually going to call the time right there because that is in fact our time. So thank you all very much. I would like to read some super chats before we go into the closing. So if you guys want to think about what your closings are going to be, and we will cover the super chats. A number of them came in. We've got half of them, I think, came in from Sifredo Zarabia, which I'm probably pronouncing incorrectly, and I'm sure there's going to be some significant correction on that one. But so let me do at least one or two, and then we'll move on. So the first one is: an airplane a kind of bike or hierarchies? I assume that that's for standing for the pro side. While I'm not entirely, I'll let you guys determine how to answer that. But I'll ask another one from Maynard Saves. Standing for truth, can you explain the anomalies with the octopus?
I think the octopus defies evolutionary theory. I don't know what he means by anomalies, but you can read through those as quickly as you want if you want to get through them.
All right.
Octopus has genes nothing else has. That's why.
I'll read them, and if there's one that somebody finds particularly interesting and they want to engage on, we can do that. Digital demonic Davros ex-Catholic here. DNA is not in the Bible. All right. Standing for truth. If you take Genesis literally, this is Sygart. If you $5. If you take Genesis really literally, then where is the age of the earth mentioned? Do you consider interpretation of genealogies to be, quote, literal?
Well, there's plenty of places in the Bible. For one, it talks about a creation of the heavens and the earth in 6 days. You can see the genealogy. You can actually calculate, even if there are some gaps, it's no more than 6,300 years. I mean, I could read through the whole Bible. I can go through passage after passage that talks about that gives at least hint to the age of the earth. And the problem with the uniformitarians is they reject a global flood, so therefore they have to conclude that the earth is old. But I don't think anyone, for the most part, is going to dispute that the Bible talks about a worldwide flood. And 2 Peter 3, right from the Bible, tells us that the scoffers in the last day will deny this global flood. So the Bible speaks almost on every page of a young earth, a young creation. And the Bible does make very specific predictions on genetics on that super chat prior to this one. And that's why we've made predictions regarding Y chromosome Adam, mitochondrial Eve, 3 major haplogroups, low genetic diversity. And that's the topic of this debate. So thanks.
All right. Thank you. And then we have same person at Jordan. What percentage of uranium-235 is found naturally? Without human intervention, can fusion occur naturally? Why doesn't it always happen? Any evidence? And does spontaneous fusion happen in nature? Those were 2 super chats.
Okay. So the natural abundance of uranium-235 is 0.7%, and some other numbers. It's very uniform across the world. So 0.7% is the enrichment today. The other one was, can fusion happen naturally? Fusion happens in the sun. That's a fusion reactor. So all you need for fusion is enough energy to overcome the Coulombic barrier, which is the repulsion between like charges. So it's very powerful, but you have to have enough to overcome it. Then the strong nuclear force can bind the nuclei together. In the sun, that happens because you have such a gravitational pressure that overcomes the Coulombic barrier. By humans, we have we try to use lasers to heat things up to give enough energy. Basically, you need a ton of energy to get fusion to happen. Does it happen spontaneously? Not outside of a star, but it does happen. There's always going to be limited numbers. I'm speaking in generalities. In large numbers, it only happens in a star. Spontaneous fission happens all the time in uranium. But I think, did that answer all the questions?
I think that answered everything that, yes, in that cluster there. We also have another one for $10 from Zafredo Zarabia again. I am extraordinarily dyslexic, and I think this person knows me and is very angry with me and is just deliberately.
I think you're doing great, Nick.
Nobody else could do better.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm not sure I believe that, but thank you. Oh boy. At Nick. So now I get one. Is it philosophically sound to believe on atheism that between 1 and 2 seconds there's an infinite amount of time, like 1.9998, yet this stream will I don't know why you're so giddy. It wasn't for you. Yet the stream will end. And Jordan says we're not here 10 minutes ago with natural evidence. So it looks like you were kind of tagged in on that one. That in my mind gets into Zeno's, in particular, I think Zeno's stadium paradox. Zeno had, if I recall, 12 paradoxes. Most were motion, but you can same problem with time. I think that's Zeno's stadium paradox, and someone actually came up with an answer to that, I think, not too long ago, but it's beyond me. But yes, it gets into whether time is infinitely divisible or not, but the human mind starts to have considerable difficulties answering questions like that. But just because we can't answer them easily in our own heads doesn't mean that A, mathematically there isn't an answer, and B, this gets into Zeno again. Time may well be infinitely divisible. Even if it is, just because we can't comprehend that doesn't mean that time is not flowing and moving forward. But you get into relativity versus quantum mechanics, and it gets confusing. How long for a special? Okay, now those are our audience questions. I think we did have at least one more. Once again from Sifredo Zarabia. How long for a kind to speciate in the biblical model? I think that's for you guys, the affirmative.
I don't want to take up too much time, but I did cover that briefly in my opening regarding the created heterozygosity hypothesis, that God created the original kinds with pre-existing functional DNA differences, which does make specific predictions on DNA function. And these predictions are coming true more and more every day, as well as very specific predictions on speciation rates, which actually directly addresses his question. There is a paper out recently. Dr. Nathaniel Jensen has an article out on Answers in Genesis regarding it. I'd look it up, but new species have been observed in finches just recently in observed time. Obviously, regarding the model, immediately post-creation, speciation events would happen rapidly, because just through processes like recombination, gene conversion, new combinations of traits are going to arise quickly. So immediately post-creation and post-flood, speciation events would be quick. Exact numbers and calculations and the technical details, I would suggest reading the article and the paper that's associated with it regarding the new species of finch that have arisen, which has actually been a confirmed prediction based on the created heterozygosity hypothesis. So lots of interesting stuff coming out from young Earth creation scientists currently.
All right, here was an interesting one. The heathen asks, for both creationists, if your God came to you and revealed that the creation story was man-made and evolution was indeed factual, would you believe him?
Oh, yeah.
Standing for truth?
Oh, I left that one for Matt to answer. Did you want to ask it again?
Well, it said for both creationists. So
okay. Can you ask it again, brother?
Sure. If your God came to you and revealed that the creation story was man-made and evolution is indeed factual, would you believe him?
If you well, I'd have to conclude whether or not I'm hallucinating or dreaming. If God himself revealed it, he's revealed the truth in his word, and there's no indication that man and ape or man and pine trees are related through common ancestry. So God already told us evolution is not true, and the science tells us it's not true as well. Thanks for the question. Good question.
And I do apologize. I'm going through most of these. We're now into the questions from the audience, and I think I'm going to do a couple more, but it looks like most of them are for the affirmative. I apologize, Jordan. You could just the mic just suddenly mutes. He's like, I'm.
If that's the case, Nick, should we jump into our conclusions and then get as many questions in after as we can? I mean, if you did chat, it's up to you. You're the moderator.
Yeah, let me do another question or two, and then I think we'll probably move on.
Can we get more nuclear engineering questions? That would be awesome.
If we could. Most of these are on genetic entropy. So emotionally stunted emoticon asked, if genetic entropy is ubiquitous, can they explain or can they give examples of wild species within the phylum Arthropoda that suffers the effects of accumulating deleterious mutations?
Well, good question from ESE there. ESE and I have had 3 or 4 debates where we talk a lot about this specific topic. In regards to his question on genetic entropy, I mean, we have examples of genetic entropy in all walks of life. I mean, we have it in bacteria, viruses, human beings. He's asking for wildlife examples, which we have provided him those before, I think, in polar bears, and Raw Matt has a few more examples in regards to that. His specific one was what?
Arthropoda.
Arthropoda. Yep. For one, which example did we give him before there, Matt? And then what would be...
Well, I mean, that most of those species they're dead. They're mostly in the fossil record, you know. So he's probably just thinking about like what maybe some bugs or insects or anything with an exoskeleton, basically. So he wants insects. So yeah, they've tested insects as well on mutation rates. So it's kind of broad spectrum, but they also have found that the mutation rate is quite fast. I'll get you the numbers in a second. Hold on. Mutation rate. Sorry. I've answered this before, so I haven't memorized all of them, but I'm close.
All right. I knew you had the citations from when the previous debate with ESE there. So I thought instead of
we have a new question. So if time is finite, how long will it take for Raw Matt to look up a citation during a live debate?
Oh.
We have that from anonymous person in the live chat.
Nick, right. You tricky moderator.
I think I may have thrown my my lack of bias out the window on that one, I guess.
All right. The study is called Exceptionally High and Diverse Mutation Rates in Insects, Small RNA. I will post the link for all of them to see.
That's what it is. Yeah, we wanted an exact answer. But what's funny about emotionally there is he's asked for many examples. We've given him more than enough in bacteria. Like I could go on and on about the evidence for genetic entropy. It's very important to the two worldviews, because that's what creation would predict: death, degeneration, extinction of a once perfect creation and genome. So Jordan didn't really have any answer during the discussion portion, and I think that's very important to understanding Genesis and the whole story of the Bible as a whole.
All right, and we actually just got in one more. It was a $10 super chat, so I think we'll hit this one, and then we'll move on to the closings. New super chat. Chat cold. Okay. Jordan, what is your favorite equation that you use on a regular basis? P.S. Good job rebutting the creationist.
Well, sadly, when you actually get to do engineering, the computer does most of the equation crunching. So, but when I was finishing out my undergrad, my senior design project was designing a nuclear reactor for an MPDT thruster to go to Mars. And my favorite equation there was the vector equation that would solve the optimal flight path to go to Saturn or Jupiter, wherever you wanted. And that's my favorite one because it took me a month, because I am not a physicist, but I was trying to read a physics paper, and they go straight from step A to step Z and don't tell you anything else. So that's my favorite equation.
All right. So what I think we will do now, we actually hadn't discussed the order for the closing. I normally go in the reverse order, but it's up to you. So since we had started with the affirmative, I would start with the dissent, if that works for both of you.
Sure. I don't have
All right. So 8 minutes, Jordan, whenever you're ready.
Get my personal timer so I can check myself.
I do apologize. I know there are some. There's a good number of questions, and some of them really quite good that we did not get to, and they're bringing that up in the live chat. I'm going to need to get going. I do apologize. So this is, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. So thank you all very much. So let's whenever you're ready.
So, at the close of this, I think I've given some good reasons to think. Certainly not all the reasons there could possibly be. That would take way more time than we've got here, even if we sat here all night. But a lot of reasons to think why the Earth is far, far older than the few thousand years cited by young Earth creationists. I focus mainly on the physics because that's my area of expertise. Excuse me. And I'll be posting my sources after the debate so you can check me, because I'm not a physicist, I'm not a biologist, I'm not a chemist. I am a layman in these subjects. So it's very important not to take what you're given at face value. You need to do the research. Real quickly, to summarize what I talked about, naturally occurring reactor at Oklo is one of the coolest things I've ever heard of, and also clearly demonstrates that we would need at least 2 billion years for the Earth, for that to happen. Without that, in order to compress the phenomena that even creationist sites like AIG and creation.com don't dispute, you'd have to have radiation levels that would be orders of magnitude above what you could safely handle. Talk about mutations, you'd be growing third arms if that were the case. Radiometric dating, despite what my interlocutors said, the initial values are not a problem for many types of radiometric dating, and scientists work very hard to overcome that. I'll post a textbook that you can read if you really want to go to sleep real fast tonight. But basically, unless God has decided to do a grand deception on a massive scale, that's not an issue. That's the only explanation. But rather than just relitigating all of the evidence that I heard. I think the time would be better spent just talking more generally about evidence and truth. First, I used to be a creationist, so I feel like that gives me a little bit of empathy for people who stand on the other side, because I used to be standing there too. And I'd like to encourage anyone who believes in a young earth, because they think it's the only way to read the word of God they were given. That's very important to them, I understand. Look around. Billions of Christians have fulfilled spiritual lives connected with the Lord while believing that God chose to create the universe 13.8 billion years ago. And in some ways, I think that that's even more dramatic. I mean, sure, it's cool for him to wave it in existence in 6 days and rest on the 7th after ripping some ribs out. But isn't it so much cooler if he set it up 14 billion years ago, created this grand machine, and then set it into motion, perfectly timed and orchestrated, so that humans would evolve at exactly the right time for his plan? Now, I don't think that's what happened, but I just say that to show that you shouldn't feel, it can often feel like you're under attack or like someone's trying to take your faith away. But here, I'm not trying to take anyone's faith away. You know, it doesn't matter to me what you believe. I'm just interested in the truth. And so I don't think anyone should see this as a threat to their faith. Believing that Genesis should be taken metaphorically shouldn't threaten anyone's soul. Jesus himself taught in parables all the time. So I don't see any intrinsic reason why Genesis couldn't be taken the same way. So the question then shouldn't be about whether or not you can trust God's word. It should be whether you can examine the universe around you and make inferences using the mind that God granted you in order to determine why we see what we see. Either you think that the universe is predictable, it was made by a God who had order and wanted his people to be able to explore it, or you think that it was created by someone who laid traps for you to fall into, things like radiometric dating and things like that, to deceive you. I think that one of those isn't compatible, and there's plenty of room for interpretation there. So what should you do with everything you heard? For me, the answer is simple, because the truth matters. I want to hold as many true beliefs as possible and as few false beliefs as possible. And if you're taking the time to listen to this debate, you probably value truth too. So what you should do is don't take my word for it. Don't take Matt's word for it. Don't take SFT's word for it. Follow the evidence. Go find out what these predictions are. Dig down into the details. You know, a lot of things sound very good at the surface, but if you dig down into it, a great example was the source of radioactive materials. They say that the pressure is enough to create it, but I can tell you as a nuclear engineer that is not the case. It is not enough pressure to overcome the Coulombic barrier. You